In recent years, the important contribution of the people of India to the First and Second World Wars has been covered more in exhibitions and school materials. However, the stories that are usually explored are those of the men. In 2018, I told some of these stories, but using the letters of the men themselves, we also explored what the impact of their service was on their families, especially the women. The multiple roles of women across the Indian subcontinent are frequently overlooked throughout its history, which makes the need to tell these stories even more important. That is why, despite all the challenges of the last 2 years, we, as women, have wanted to tell the stories of some of the Indian women who did the most remarkable thing, of wanting to serve alongside men in the British Indian forces during the Second World War. Even before the start of the Second World War, auxiliary units were created in the British forces for women in recognition that a global conflict was going to require effort from across society. Across the British Empire, there were millions of women involved with war work, in their factories, agriculture, and nursing. However, as the war progressed, more and more women were required to take on roles, and no one would be exempt. Women's auxiliary units appeared in many parts of the Empire and Commonwealth, but the idea of having women in the military was not welcomed by everyone, especially when many people believed that women should only engage with traditional roles. This prejudice was even further amplified when it was suggested that women of different ethnicities should also be recruited to serve. In 1942, the creation of the women's auxiliary units to the existing British Indian military began. We found a series of correspondence that addresses what level of authority women in the British Indian forces would have. In particular, will women officers in the British Indian forces be able to give white men orders? This question is raised in several ways, and the authorities in the War Office suggested that a female officer in the Indian forces must have the equivalence of a female officer in the British forces. The solution for those who were still unhappy was they found a way to ensure that interaction between the new units and the existing British Indian ones were kept at a minimum. For women at the time, where prejudice was considered normal, it was just as normal to be excluded from the discussion about authority in the service. India in the war years incorporated the whole of the subcontinent, including modern-day Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Burma, as well as what is today's India. However, they did not recruit from the entire continent at first. Instead, they focused on a few key towns and cities. As the war progressed, women from more areas were enticed to serve. It also focused on certain types of women, such as those who were literate. This also meant middle class or educated working class. It automatically barred huge numbers of women in a society where many people were not literate. Ideally, those who had a male relative serving or that had served were desirable, so that they would understand what military service meant. One of the white British women who signed up had her experiences recorded when she was living back in the UK following the war. We have used her memories throughout this film.
One didn't go in to earn a living, one went in to do a job. It's quite a different thing altogether. So you felt a certain amount of freedom to do what you wanted in that way, because if you paid for it, you could have it.
One key area of recruitment, and a group that were keen to get involved, were women from the Anglo-Indian community. These were women who were often mixed race and/or from European communities, settled in India. For instance, there are several Portuguese names on the roll lists. What made this group appealing to the British was that they were already slightly separated from a lot of Indian cultural practices. They were usually educated, and many of them were keen to get involved and get away from the confines of home.
I remember I went down to Coimbatore in Southern Command. It's a very hot little place, but quite delightful. A lot of Portuguese.
The creation of this unit was not a piece of propaganda or just a bit of fun. The roles for these women were very real and were to be governed by proper military structures. The purpose of this unit was the same as it was in the UK, to ensure that men were free to go off and fight and be in frontline roles. This meant that women would be clerks, drivers, logistics organisers, signallers, and involved with civil defence organisation. The Wakai had a proper structure, insignia, and a place in the overall military command.
I remember once Lady James was away, and the Begum Shah Nawaz, who was a rather important woman, a Muslim woman in India, was to take the parade for some reason.
The British and Indian authorities were not ignorant of the need to be delicate in how they approached putting Indian women, women of colour, and women generally, into military kit. The British needed to be mindful of Indian customs and religions, to present a proper military organisation with order, control and regularity, and for this the uniform was key. To solve this, the British and Indian authorities chose to introduce a range of military dress that included saris alongside the usual military uniform. This provided the Wakai with a very clear identity. It was female, Indian, and military.
They did have a choice, but they usually elected to wear their saris. And when they marched, they looked absolutely wonderful. How they did it, I never could understand, but I have pictures, or maybe you've got them now, of them walking down, a whole platoon of Indian women in there. They didn't like the khaki much, but they were so graceful in there. No hats. They didn't wear hats.
So there was a regulation sari then?
Yes,
Yeah.
khaki.
Yeah.
And they were allowed to wear sandals. But if they wore skirts and tunics, then they had to wear shoes, which they do find difficult because they're so used to the open sandals.
And you did mention something about their underwear, which was quite interesting.
Yes, well, it was brought to the director's attention that the Indian women in general didn't wear knickers, they called them then. And so they brought out a regulation. For some reason they thought that this was not a good thing. And they brought out a regulation to say that all Indian women would wear knickers if they wore saris. I don't know how far they went in carrying it out. I remember there was a bit of an uproar because it did not go down well. So, but they didn't rescind the order. It remained.
Women from British families who were residing in India often married to or were the daughters of serving British officers. These were the choice of officers in the Wakai. This meant they were largely white, although that was not always the case, and mixed-race women and those from certain Indian families can be seen in the images and on the records.
Women's Auxiliary Corps India, it was like they didn't know. They thought they would send service women from other parts of the country, from Britain. They did send ATS out, just a limited number, and then we'd get them used to the climate first. They weren't allowed to work for a fortnight, which our officers didn't like very much because some officers had lived in cooler parts of India. They had to come down to the plains. They still, no 2 weeks for them. Given there were the three nationalities, because the Indians and Anglo-Indians are entirely different.
Wakai covered the Army and the RAF, unlike in the UK where they were individual female units for both. However, it was decided to set up a separate unit of Indian women to specifically support the Royal Indian Navy. These were known as the Women's Royal Indian Naval Service, RINS. Once again, the roles that these women were recruited to do were very real. The RINS were sometimes given basic training on ships. While they would not be sailing off in them, they did need to know how they worked and what did what. The same complexities existed for the RINS as had for the Wakai. For example, a version of the dress code included a sari. While not the most practical dress for being on a ship, it was important that the RINS appealed across all groups of British Indian society. We know from a memorial booklet that survives from this time and was presented to a British officer that there seems to be a lot of interaction between the different ranks of the RINS and between male and female officers at certain posts. 2/3 of the RINS were made up of Indian women. In the Wakai and the RINS, we know from the records that some of the women loved their roles. It was a real chance to do something different. However, we can also see that some disliked the structures and the regulations that military life brings. Sadly, the surviving records through time and movement have not maintained perfect conditions for us to know exactly how many joined up or who left during training. From some of the surviving testimony, we also know that there was some racism and prejudice amongst the women. This most often played out in social situations and when different groups were housed together. The military provided housing for the service women. The housing was fairly basic and not dissimilar to hostel-style accommodation. Looking at the records, one of the issues for some was how strict life was in the hostels. What you could do, when you could leave, who you could see. This led some to leave. However, for others, this accommodation also provided the opportunity to bond and be away from home.
They didn't actually share bedrooms, but they did have to share sitting rooms with the Anglo-Indians and Indians, and they didn't like it. There was a bit of trouble about that. And the chief principal matron agreed with them. She thought her British nurses should have their own accommodation, their own sitting rooms, separate ones. The women did a good job, They worked hard, because you must remember the temperatures down in Delhi were 110, anything up to higher than that. Calcutta was the worst. Unless you sat under a fan, your dress dripped.
Yes.
The rules and regulations for the Wakai and the Rins indicates that the two units had full military purpose and governance. This means the two units were accorded some level of respect and authority. Within India, the women were respected for joining the services, but through archives, it can be seen that they were also considered as insignificant. They certainly weren't given coverage in different newspapers. Attitudes to women would have meant that some people disagreed with having them, especially Indian women, in the military. However, those people seem to have been silenced during the war itself. After the war representatives of the two units were brought to England, they were invited to a royal reception, indicating that they were given a clear military status. The picture we have given you is mixed. Most people know nothing about these women who served in the British Indian forces. The fact that they are overlooked is due to a few key reasons, such as sexism, racism, and time. Because of all these issues, and probably others, the names of most of the women who served in Wakai and the Rins are not all known. There are no memorials to them. We do not know how their service changed their lives and what they went on to do. Just as importantly, we do not know what impact their service had on other Indian women, on men, British and Indian, or on the communities they worked in. But from our work, what we know now is that you can tell they existed, that they served and they made a difference. Now you can remember them. We spoke to some Indian women in the Army, RAF and Navy to find out more about their stories and what representation means to them.
Did I ever saw myself in these roles? No, is an honest answer, because I was always passionate about this, but never knew how this will be coming to light. I'm a person of colour, I'm a first Sikh, I'm a first Sikh woman to do this role, I'm a first chaplain to be into this role, and you know, the list is endless.
Things that I noticed when I was younger is we never really got taught that when we have the Memorial Days, for example, that we had Asian people in general fighting in World War I, World War II. You didn't really hear about it much. You saw people wearing poppies and you would automatically link it to the British, you know, the Americans, not necessarily the Asian population that were involved. And as I got older and started reading a bit more, it was evident that that wasn't the case.
The job role I'm in now, I meet like so many people, so many different regiments, so many different trades, and I'm like the first and only Bengali woman that I've known the whole 5 years, and other people, for them as well, I'm the first and only Bengali person they've ever known. Even saying Bangladesh, they're like, oh, where's that on the map? And so I think for me, it's like, I just feel like I'm one of the first that I know and other people know and they can relate to, so it's a quite nice feeling.
The first question I'm still asked by a lot of people in our community is, oh, Preet, are you not getting married yet? You know, absolutely no interest in my career. I'm a British Army officer as an Asian female, you know, whether it's even buying my first house or all these other things, or the fact that I'm training to do this huge expedition, it goes back to what they know. And I think a lot of that is education as well. So, you know, let's educate these people, whether it's elders in our community or gatekeepers.
When I joined, I was really nervous. I was really nervous about the prejudice for my colour as opposed to my gender. Thankfully, it has been a very enjoyable journey. I've met some amazing people.
Being an Asian woman, that time I would say I'm getting a bit old now, but that time I was 17. Moving from Punjab to UK was completely eye-opener to me to see a Sikh female, Harpreet, who joined the army before myself. They just wanted for me to create a history and just live in the legacy of our ancestors from World War I and II.
I'm an honorary captain, as I earlier said, and I was appointed by Her Majesty and the Royal Navy. Well, yes, it is a face. You're an advocate for the Royal Navy, for the communities, for people out there in the world, that there is an Asian woman of this rank. People are beginning to see that, especially when I became a captain. It's the highest role for a Muslim woman or a man to be extremely proud of. I wish my father was alive.
I still feel that there's a lot more work to be done, and if I can play a little role in creating that awareness and bringing people together, because we talk about history, right? This happened 10 years ago, 5 years ago. Who's going to talk about us? We need to create that history for the generations to come, so that they can proudly look at that history. We are the positive side of the history.
I would want to learn so much more about those women and use them as role models for the modern, I can say young because I'm old now, younger generation, to say, look, these are women who have achieved something despite all the trials and tribulations they went through, and it's stuff that we will never have visibility of, because it's a different world.